Welcome. Good morning. Glad to have everybody here on a slightly chilly morning. Not too bad, I guess. Really excited to have y'all all here. This is something that we feel strongly about. We love plants. We love sharing plants and gardening and horticulture with everybody. So that's why we started this series. As a staff, we felt we do a lot of talks, we do a lot of things that people have to pay for and come in, and they are wonderful. You should really look at our programs. But we really wanted something to introduce people, either introduce them to gardening or introduce people who are new to the area to gardening. I know I've talked to some people from Duluth and all kinds of places. So I'm curious, how many people have been to a program here before? All right, I like that. That's a good number of people. How many people are new to gardening but have lived here for a while? A few people, great. How many people have lived in Raleigh for less than 2 years? Or the Raleigh area? Less than 1 year? Keep your hands up if this applies. Less than 1 year? 6 months? A month? Well, it is one of the best places in the world to garden. It's one of the best places. It's really one of the centers of horticulture. Starting with NC State University. NC State is one of the top 3 horticultural programs in the country. The top 3 kind of duke it all out, but they probably all agree that they're at least in the top 3. We also have fantastic gardens in the area. We here at J.C. Raulston, and I'll go into this a little bit when I give my talk at the end, but we're really a research institute. We trial plants. We always have new things here. We're always changing things up. We have out at UNC, the Botanic Garden out there. They do native plant conservation and do just a phenomenal job with that. Really great stuff happening out there with native plant conservation. Duke Gardens, Sarah P. Duke Gardens in Durham is a display garden, and they're doing some of the best horticulture on the East Coast. Really doing some wonderful things, great displays, great plants, really fantastic folks. And then our partner also is Juniper Level Botanic Garden, and that's at Plant Delights Nursery. If you didn't get a catalog of theirs and you don't get it, pick one up. They have some of the most amazing, mostly perennials, like Doug is going to talk about, anywhere in the world. People order from them all over the place. And on a rainy day, it's kind of good to read because the owner, Tony Avent, has a somewhat different sense of humor. So it's always interesting to read those. You can always tell a plant named by Tony. Hosta Outhouse Delight is kind of this kind of thing. We're able to offer this free program, though, really thanks to one of our partners, Leaf and Limb. They sponsor this, so make sure you go over and thank them. They're quite a bit different from most other companies. They are really all about tree health because trees are essential for our planet. They've been in the news quite a bit lately. They're probably the only arboriculture company I know of that is not cutting down trees anymore. That they are all about preserving, helping trees live, and not taking them out. They've got phenomenal information on their blog, YouTube, whatever. Sign up for their newsletter. They really good information, and I'm told they have some great information on all these topics we're talking about right now. But they really are really in line with what we're all about, which is all about preserving, growing plants. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Arboretum and the area later on. So I want to introduce our first speaker. Doug Ruhren is our gardens manager here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. I always say we go about things the wrong way sometimes. Doug has been volunteering here for 30 plus years. He took some breaks to actually go and work in some other areas like Daniel Stowe Botanic Garden, the American Camellia Society Gardens, and places like that. But he came back here and he volunteered, and then we started paying him, which is bad business sense. But Doug is Doug is well known all across the country. I think he's currently designing a perennial border for the Atlanta Botanic Garden. He's designed gardens all over the place and is just a wizard with perennials. So he's going to talk about herbaceous perennials, ones that any new gardener should know, should have success with, and how to grow them. So, Doug, thank you very much.
Can you hear me? It sounds like the mic is working. Good morning. It's great to have this big crowd of people out this morning for this symposium. I'm going to start off by thanking Leaf and Limb for all the free work they do here. They were out here earlier this week grinding the stumps of the old holly hedge we cut down. I have two comments I want to make. I'm a relocated Yankee. I was born and raised in New Jersey near New York City. I moved to North Carolina in 1979. My main comment in regards to relocating to this area, don't waste any time regretting what you can't grow here that you could grow wherever you came from, because the diversity of plants you can grow here is just absolutely huge. The second comment I wanted to make, because there have been several questions today and over the recent weeks, is it normal to have so much in bloom this time of year? Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of plants that bloom in the winter months whenever the weather's mild enough. It's one of the great glories of gardening in a warmer part of the country than the Northeast. So don't panic when you see things blooming this time of year. Most of the winter blooming plants have a large number of buds, and it's really typical for us to have a mild spell and then turn bitterly cold again. Generally, those open flowers will be destroyed by the cold, but the next mild spell, all those buds that weren't yet open will open and we'll have another flush of bloom. So there have been winters when some things have bloomed continuously all winter because it never got real cold. What's more typical is to have these little springs on and off all winter. And with that, I'm going to start on my presentation. What is a perennial? I first have to get some technical stuff out of the way, because if we're going to have a conversation, we have to understand the terminology, but don't get too scared. What is a perennial? In general, when people use the term perennial, what they mean is a winter hardy herbaceous perennial, and I'll go over all those separate parts of that long phrase. A perennial is a plant that lives year to year. So though we don't generally call trees and shrubs perennial, they are perennial because they live from year to year. They are woody perennials. What plants are not perennials? Well, pretty much all plants fit into three categories: annuals, biennials, and perennials. Annuals start from seed, complete their life cycle in one growing season, whether it's the summer growing season or the winter growing season. Think of our winter weeds like chickweed. Its whole life cycle is completed during the cold months of the year. A biennial is a plant that has a 2-year life cycle. The first year it grows vegetatively. The second year it blooms, sets seeds, and dies. So a perennial is a plant that may take a bunch of years to get to blooming size, but continues to regrow every year and live for years. What does herbaceous mean? Herbaceous means lacking permanent woody stems. You think of a daylily or a hosta, dies to the ground each winter. Some perennials might appear fairly woody, things like an aster or a goldenrod, but those stems died to the ground every year. Of course, all of these definitions are pretty black and white, but in the real world, there's a lot of variation. But these are the basic terms we use when dealing with this topic. What does winter hardy mean? Well, that's relative to the area you're growing in. There are things that are winter hardy in Raleigh that weren't winter hardy if you came from the colder part of the country. Growing up, I grew cannas and gladiolus, but we had to dig them every winter and protect them over the winter in a frost-free location. Here, we leave them in the ground because they survive the milder winters here. Chris, it's not behaving. Here we go. So when we use the term perennial, what we really mean is a winter hardy herbaceous perennial. I had to say a little bit about scientific names. Scientific names are what most people call Latin names. You know, they can seem a little daunting. They're generally not all, it's not complete gobbledygook, and many plants, their common name is also the same as their scientific name. So you probably already know a bunch of scientific names of plants like Iris, Forsythia, Nandina, Hosta. Those are all their scientific names as well as their common names. Some scientific names are really similar to the common name, like tulips, the scientific name is tulipa. Lilies are lilium. So instead of going into a total panic when you see a scientific name, just calm down. Sometimes you can figure it out. Let's say this group here today was a class in high school, and you're going to spend a whole school year together. By the end of the school year, you know everybody's first and last name. On the first day, you're probably sitting there thinking, I'll never know all these people's names. Well, it's the same way with learning the scientific names of plants. There are a lot of reasons to know the scientific names of plants, maybe even more so if you're coming from another part of the country, because the common names of plants often change when you go from one part of the country. I grew up calling narcissus daffodils. When you move south, some southerners call them jonquils or buttercups, or I always knew forsythia as forsythia. In this area, some people call them yellow bells. So, there's no right or wrong, but it just points out the value of knowing the scientific name, because that doesn't generally change. A species name consists of two parts. Here it goes, a binomial. The first part of the name is the name of the genus, and then the second part is the specific epithet. All the oaks belong to the genus Quercus. A white oak is Quercus alba, alba meaning white. So the species name is that two-part binomial. I think that's all the technical, cultivar. I'll never correct somebody if they use the word variety instead of cultivar, because they essentially mean the same thing, but variety is just used for wild plants. A cultivar, the word cultivar is an abbreviation of cultivated variety, meaning a selection of a plant that arose in gardens. It's often abbreviated just CV. And cultivars are always in single quotes, so you might encounter that as you're studying a plant label. All right, now on to the actual plants. These are plants that I think, these aren't just basic plants for the beginner, but these are really very dependable, delightful, reliable plants that I think even the plant snob might want to grow in your garden. This is a little flowering maple. It gets its common name of flowering maple because the foliage is somewhat maple-shaped, but it's actually related to hibiscus. And this is in bloom today out in the garden. It's in bloom almost every month of the year. It's does well in part sun or light shade. Grows about 3 to 4 feet tall. And the nice thing is that hummingbirds also enjoy the flowers. The alliums are the same genus. The genus Allium is the same genus as onions and garlic, but there are many more ornamental alliums than there are edible ones. And there are many that are grown from bulbs, sold by in the fall when you buy daffodil and tulip bulbs, but there are a lot of non-bulbous ones that are just small herbaceous perennials. And this is a fairly new introduction, but it is a really superb one. Blooms for quite a few months in mid to late summer. It's about, maybe 12 inches tall, and really easy. There's a couple other really good ones that came to mind. Pink Planet. Allium tuberosum is the garlic chives, which can do double duties as a kitchen herb or a garden ornamental. And Allium nutans. Let's see, just shows a similar allium in the garden setting. In this presentation, probably have an equal number of plants for the sun garden and the shade garden. I thought about, doing all the sun plants at one time and all the shade plants at the next, but then you end up with a genus like Iris, where some of the members are for sun and some are for the shade. And so it was like, well, do I divide up one genus into two different parts of the presentation or cover all the iris? So we'll be jumping back and forth between sun and shade plants. The Aspidistra, its common name is cast iron plant because it's such a tough plant. It was a common house plant in Victorian times, in those dark, I was going to say unheated, but heated by coal stoves, houses of the Victorian era. It's evergreen, so it gives you that broad, beautiful foliage year-round. Definitely a shade plant. There's a lot of plants that will sort of go either sun or shade. Aspidistra won't die in a sunny location, but the foliage will burn and it'll look very awful, but it's very dependable in the shade garden, even tolerant of dry shade. Plain green is beautiful. There are a lot of selections with spotted or striped foliage. The asters, most asters are native to North America. The taxonomists, the people who classify organisms, have recently split the Aster genus into a bunch of new genera. Genera is plural of genus. And instead of the lovely, simple, and concise name Aster referring to stars, as in asteroid, we now have these really long names, but I stuck with Aster in part because when you go into a garden center, there's a good chance they're still labeled Aster. But Aster will appear as in their common name anyway. The asters that show up most frequently in garden centers, especially the big box retailers, or New England and New York asters, they do perfectly fine here, but they bloom so early, usually August or early September when it's still full-fledged summer here, that they bloom for almost a week, which is far too short for a plant that's taking up room. But some of our other species of asters will bloom for most of the month. Aster oblongifolius, Raydon's favorite, will bloom easily 3 weeks, if not 4 weeks. And then there's another selection of it, Fanny's Aster and October Sky. Fanny's Aster is really nice because when Raydon's favorite is starting to go out of bloom, Fanny's Aster is starting, and so you have 2 months of bloom out of this one species. And the asters are really good for pollinators in late fall, in late summer and early fall. There's still a lot of insects in the garden. And most asters are for sun, but and this is another one for sun. And this one doesn't quite fit into this topic of herbaceous perennials because this is a really odd aster in that it's a woody vine. It does not dive to the ground, but it's sort of an orphan because it often doesn't get covered by people covering woody plants. And this will bloom October well into November. And it'll climb 8-10 feet tall if it's given some support. But there are some asters for the shade garden. This is one of the more common ones. This is the white wood aster, Aster divaricatus. The flowers are nice. What I really value it for is that the foliage is evergreen. The foliage completely covers the ground. It spreads at a moderate rate, so it's never something that's going to take over a garden, but it's really useful as a small-scale ground cover in the garden. Cannas, I mentioned them earlier as an example where they're not winter hardy in zone 6, but here they survived the winter and left in the ground. They give you a wide range of colorful flowers and foliage. There is one significant problem with cannas. There's a leaf roller, a caterpillar, that will damage the foliage. Some varieties are less likely to get it, but we cut away the spoiled foliage. They're constantly putting up new growth all summer long. They come in a range of sizes from 3 foot to 8 foot. Most of them are more in the 5 foot range. And no one's asked a question this morning yet. Do deer eat it? Cannas, in my experience, are always left alone by deer, but someone's going to raise their hand and say, they eat it in my garden, which is deer. Deer differ from one spot to another, but and it also points out how difficult it is to talk about what deer do and do not eat, because invariably people will have the opposite experiences. Cannas will thrive in just average soil, but if you have a wet site, they'll really be happy in a wet site. And, some of our soils are not well drained. You can do all sorts of things to modify the soil and make it so the soil is well drained. But I think a better tactic is to work with that wet site and then, instead of fighting it, choose plants that thrive in a wet site. There's no end of really good garden plants that love wet sites. This is just pictures. These pictures are ones that I took that I had on a CD, and they didn't transfer very well to this format because I couldn't get them. I thought I had succeeded in getting them compressed so you'd actually see the whole picture, but it didn't work out. Occasionally in this presentation, I'm not talking about a specific plant, but a whole group of plants. And later on, I'll mention some really good ornamental grasses, but most grasses are for the sun, and the carexes, or the sedges, are related to grasses, and the majority of them are shade plants. So you get this grass-like texture in the shade garden, and many of them have colorful foliage, and some of those are evergreen. Deer tend not to eat them, but sometimes rabbits will eat sedges. But Carex oceamensis, the one that's pictured there, is an evergreen one that's once it's established, is very very sturdy, reliable plant. Nowadays, there are a lot of selections of it. Evergold is a really old variety, but there's a new series of them, the Evercolor series, and there's a bright yellow one called Everillo. There's a white striped one called Everest. They're fairly common in garden centers, and they're really good plants in the ground or in the container. Two other really good sedges, Carex blue Zinger. The previous one, the Carex oceamensis, is a clump former. The blue Zinger spreads at a moderate rate, so it's a good small-scale ground cover for shade gardens. And it's evergreen. But I like to occasionally remind people that green is also a color. We always want, a former director that I worked under said there are the three most important things that a public garden display are. The first one is color, the second one is color, and anyone that guess what the third most important thing in garden is? Color, yeah. So we're always, I've sort of been brainwashed into always being focused on having as much color as possible, but green is also a color, and it can be a very beautiful color. Carex appalachica, as you might guess from the second part of its name, is the Appalachian sedge, lovely little green thing, a nice fine texture. Because in garden design, we're not just working with color, but also the shapes and textures of things. Okay. The Epimedium. Here's a good example where a plant has a common name, but nobody uses the common name. I've known all my life that the common name for Epimedium is barrenwort, but I never hear anyone use that one. Everyone calls them Epimediums. I know in the Plant Delights catalog, I don't know if they came up with another common name, fairy wings, which is sort of sweet, because these are small shade-loving perennials. They are tough as all get out. You plant them and they generally will persist forever. You have a range of flower colors, white, pink, yellow, orange, reddish, red. They can be either spreading or clump forming. So these are things you need to learn when you're deciding whether or not to buy a plant. Hopefully that information is on the label, but nowadays, you take out your smartphone and do a Google search. They can be either evergreen or deciduous, ones that turn brown after a hard frost in the fall and disappear over winter. The evergreen ones are especially nice because you have this attractive foliage year-round. You'll want to cut that foliage off by late winter or so. They come into growth real early, and by then the evergreen foliage is pretty shabby. And it's really much easier to cut the old foliage off before they're putting up new growth, because otherwise you have to go in with surgical precision and cut out each leaf individually. And the ones that spread are not overly rampant, so again, they're a good small-scale ground cover. I've come to really appreciate ground covering plants because if a plant is a clump former, the gap in between neighboring plants is a place for weeds to grow, but some of these plants that completely cover the ground exclude a lot of weeds. And Mark mentioned Plant Delights Nursery. They are one of the leading breeders of epimediums right now, and the selection in this spring's catalog is really good. Okay. Oh, and I made a point now. In a lot of common names, you'll see wort, W-O-R-T. I learned recently that actually should be pronounced wort, and it's just has nothing to do with funny growths on your fingers. It's an Old English name for a plant.
How did you pronounce it again?
Wort, like it was spelled W-E-R-T. Ferns. Here's one of the examples where I'm not talking about one genus, but a whole bunch of genera. There are so many great ferns available, and Plant Delights, again, has an incredible selection of ferns. In the garden, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of different types of ferns. And like the epimediums, they can be evergreen or deciduous, clump forming or spreading. There are so many really beautiful ones. I probably value the evergreen ones because you have that foliage year-round. Again, as in the case of so many evergreen herbaceous perennials, you're going to want to cut the old foliage off in late winter before they start putting up new growth. That is not something that the plant needs you to do because the plant doesn't mind at all if it has shabby old foliage, but you're going to want to do it just to improve the appearance of your garden. I've never known deer to eat ferns. I figure that ferns are ancient plants. They're much older than flowering plants. And so they were around when dinosaurs here were alive. So the ferns that still exist were ones that the dinosaurs didn't eat. So that's probably why the deer don't eat them. The one pictured is autumn fern. The newest fronds have this lovely sort of rusty red coloration, and when they mature, they're green. But it's an evergreen fern that is handsome, 10 months of the year. There's that brief period in late winter when you cut the fronds away, when it's not making any presence in the garden, but is really beautiful most of the year. have a number of other ferns listed there that are really good additions. Japanese painted fern, many select cultivars of it nowadays. It is deciduous, so it disappears with frost, but very colorful. Most ferns are green, but that has silver and purple in the foliage. We have a really long growing season, so some things, if they are shabby by midsummer, cut them to the ground and they'll put up brand new foliage, and that's certainly something I do with Japanese painted fern. I'm not saying it's something you have to do, because if it's been a mild summer and been plenty of moisture, it probably looks good all summer, but if it's gotten shabby, you can cut it down. I do that with some real long flowering perennials too. If by midsummer they're shabby looking, I'll cut them to the ground, and they'll soon be in new growth, and before too long back in bloom. Now, this is a plant that Dr. J.C. Raulston introduced to the Arboretum, somewhere about 30 years ago. And it's just now getting into the mainstream nursery trade. Most everybody knows the common Gaillardia, the Indian blanket flower, that typically has a flower of that same form, but it's a red petal with yellow tips to the petals. The common Gaillardia is a real easy plant, but it tends not to be perennial. It tends to bloom itself to death. If you're lucky, there'll be new seedlings to replace it. I wish it was reliably perennial, but it's really more like an annual. But Gaillardia aestivalis is almost indestructible. It's certainly perennial. And, having been in the Arboretum for somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 years, I've seen it go through many of a nasty, hot, dry summer, and it just continues blooming all summer long. The wild type Gaillardia aestivalis is a yellow flower. This is actually the subspecies Heuchera, but I thought you'll get to where you need to go with just the first two parts of its name. And the variety Heuchera also comes in white, and the white one we have has a burgundy center to the flower, and it's really a very pretty thing too. This one is very close to the one that Plant Delight's Nursery named Grape Sensation, and this is a full sun plant and extremely drought tolerant. So look for it. I've seen it in garden centers in this area, but hopefully it will become more widely available. Good. Now, there are many, many species. Is that a question?
Yes.
Yes.
All these plants, is this assuming that they're all planted in the ground, or any of them potted? Like, does it make a difference?
The question was, I think the question is, are all these plants you grow in the ground, or can they be potted?
Yeah, like, does it, like, if they're potted, does that mean that they're less able to grow year after year?
The issue you get when you plant something in a pot in the wintertime is that the whole root ball will freeze in a cold spell. So something that's hardy in zone 6 or colder would tolerate that, but a plant that's hardy in zone 7, like the cast iron plant I showed earlier, the Aspidistra, might not survive the winter in the pot. Something like a Hosta would survive the winter in the pot here. But a plant that's only hardy to zone 7 might not survive the winter in a pot if it freezes solid.
If you brought it in, like to a garage?
Yeah, if you wanted to grow something like a cast iron plant or something that's that shouldn't be allowed to freeze solid in a pot, you could move it into a garage on the coldest day. For a sort of similar example, I have a lot of houseplants. I don't have enough room for my houseplants. So all my desert cactus are spending most of the winter on my screen porch, because unless it goes below freezing, they're fine as long as they're dry. So most of the time they're out, but if we're going to be 28 or lower, I bring them in the house. So if you want to have a big display pot of something that shouldn't freeze solid, we'll leave it out most of the winter, but if we're going to be real cold and move it into the garage or a closet. No, my carport had a closet that I could move plants into. Geraniums, big genus. A lot of them are not as commonly available as they used to be. Some geraniums want sun, some geraniums want shade. If you're only slightly aware of geraniums, you might think that somebody is an idiot when they tell you that this a particular geranium wants shade, because that's what a former client said to me. But Geranium striatum is an extremely dependable one. This is the common color of it. It's also available in pale pink and white. Has a big heavy bloom in mid-spring to early summer, and then a lighter bloom on and off all summer. These are two geraniums that are definitely shade plants, and these are two of my favorite plants for shade, because not only are they showy in bloom, but they're evergreen. And they are spreading plants, again, not a rampant spreader, but great small-scale ground cover. Geranium macrorrhizum, there's white selection and pale pink as well as this darker color. The leaves are a couple inches across, strongly pine-scented. In a former client's garden where there were lots of deer and they ate a lot of the other geraniums, they didn't ever bother these two, I think because of the pine scent of the foliage. And then Geranium cantabrigiense. When you see that random X between the genus name and the specific epithet, that indicates that it's a hybrid. And one of its parents is Geranium macrorrhizum. It's a smaller scale plant, and I have found that it blooms longer than its parent, and I'm guessing it's because it's being a hybrid, it might be sterile, and so it keeps on blooming longer than its parent. But both of them are superb plants for shade, tolerating fairly dry shade. They would not be happy in a wet spot, but just average moisture or a little bit drier. After either one, especially macrorrhizum, after it's been in the ground for a while, I'll go and dig up a clump, divide it into single stems, and just plant them out. And I've done that, like in December and January, and every one of them will take.
And you said that was shade?
Yes.
Those,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Most geraniums are sun plants, but these two don't want sun, but they thrive in a light shade. Yeah, superb. Ornamental grasses. Most grasses want sun. There are a few that prefer shade. They are a very different shape and texture than most other herbaceous perennials. They also move with the slightest breeze, so I think they add a lot of movement to the garden. Some of the very best ones are native species. The list on the right, switchgrass, the panicums, are really beautiful all winter long. If you go out in the Arboretum in the winter months, you'll see a lot of examples of them. Little blue stem. Now that's a real long scientific name, Schizophyrium scoparium. Those are smaller scale grasses, about 2 feet, maybe 30 inches tall. The fountain grasses, the pennisediums, there's tiny little ones like little bunny to great big ones. And muley grass is that beautiful purpley red blooming one that blooms in September, October. Yeah, here's a summer shot of grasses. Again, a picture that is much bigger than the screen. And the same grasses in the winter time. We don't cut them down until about late February, early March. They're generally beautiful. Most ornamental grasses are beautiful through the winter months. They also provide some shelter for some little creatures over winter. The ginger lilies, the hedychiums, are somewhat like cannas. There's not the wide range of selections with colorful foliage, but the floral display is much like the cannas. They are not bothered by the canna leaf roller. I've never noticed any insect problems on the ginger lilies. And it, again, in my experience, is that deer leave them alone as well. That whole complex of related families, the ginger family, the canna family, the banana family, they all seem to be left alone by deer. The one in the picture is a selection called Tara. Orange is a common color. There's also pink ones and yellow ones and white ones. Hedychium coronarium is a plant that has been common in gardens in the south for a long time. Has large, white, fragrant flowers. August, September, October. Everybody knows daylilies, I assume. Daylilies are pretty indestructible. Now, if you have deer, they will eat the flowers. But beyond the problem with deer, I can't think of any other problems daylilies have. They'll continue to bloom even if you never divide them. Nowadays, they range from things under a foot to selections that are 6 feet tall in bloom, believe it or not. And you know, the range of colors you see in that picture. There's normal range is sort of midsummer, early to midsummer, but they're really early selections. A lot of breeders are breeding for late blooms too. I always get depressed when my daylilies are done blooming. So I'm always gathering, collecting any of the ones that are late blooming. This is a taller daylily. This is one called Statuesque. It's about 5 feet tall in bloom. Hostas, superb plants for shade garden. They are just deciduous, so they disappear in the winter. We tend to sublet garden space. There are some things that grow in the winter months, and we often will plant them around the things that disappear in the winter months. Small bulbs are a good companion to the bigger hostas, or things like toothwort, Antaria, is dormant in the summer but comes up in the fall and grows through the winter months. Yes?
I have 2 questions. Going back to the grasses, I have something around, I have a series of what's called small mondo grass.
Yeah.
It's around Japanese maple.
Right.
It's in an area that's partially shaded.
Right.
So you said that grasses are predominantly good for sun areas.
Right.
Is that not a true grass, or is
It's
it an
not
exception?
a true. Mondo grass is not a true grass. There are a lot of plants that have grass in their common name that are not true grasses.
Okay.
And mondo grass is Ophiopogon. It used to be in the lily family, believe it or not. I don't remember what family it's in now because that family has been chopped up into so many. And it definitely prefers shade.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then I had another second question. Now that you showed Hosta, I've read online among gardeners here in North Carolina that you have to watch hostas because of the proclivity for voles to go at the roots.
Right.
I've been told to plant them with like a pot around them.
Yes.
Is that correct?
I'll repeat the question. The question was, it's the issue of hostas and voles. Voles are not the same as moles. Voles with a V are essentially just short-tailed bat mice. But they burrow underground and they will eat the root systems and crowns of a lot of plants, including some woody plants. Planted a camellia last winter. I realized, it's leaning over. And I knew right away what was going on. The voles had eaten all the roots off. With smaller things like hostas, smaller as opposed to like a camellia, you can plant them in pots and sink the pots in the ground. Voles don't seem to understand that if they went over the lip of the pot, they'd be right there. But I know a garden in Cary where this gentleman has been growing hostas for many, many decades, and they're all in pots sunk in the ground with, maybe an inch of the rim of the pot above ground. And that will keep the voles from eating it. You can also spend a lot of money on these metal mesh baskets that work really well. But we all probably have that stash of empty nursery pots somewhere in the carport that you could just use for free. Yeah. So voles can devastate a hosta collection, but you can deal with it by planting them in pots.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I read online that juicy fruit gum is a good deterrent for voles.
No, juicy fruit gum is recommended for moles with an N.
I read for voles.
Oh, okay. Well, try it and tell me what your results were. Yeah. Yeah.
Make sure there's no holes in the pot, because the holes will just a hole bigger to get into the pot.
But there has to be holes in the pot so the pot will drain.
The hardware pot all around the holes. So they
Oh, well, yeah, so you have holes in the pot.
Holes, they run into the hardware pot.
Okay. Well, then you could just plant them in hardware cloth. Yeah. 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 Cats probably work too. I became a dog owner in 2008. I had always been a cat owner, and so my experience with voles was extremely limited until I no longer had cats. I think that's enough on voles. Nowadays, hostas are available from teeny tiny things that you may be better off displayed in a container above ground to great big giant things that are about 3 feet tall and 6 foot wide. So, and I like hostas. I never want to fill my garden with hostas, but what I really value are the hostas that look good for most of the growing season. So when I like to visit gardens featuring hostas is in August, September, October, and see which ones still look good. Because some varieties, they all look great in the spring, but some can get tired looking by midsummer. So if you visit gardens in the late summer, fall, and see which ones still look good, those are the ones that I would add to my own garden. Yes?
Could you, when you're able to, could you go to the previous slide? Yeah, that one. Thank you.
Okay. Statuesque is, I presume you're writing down the name, Statuesque. It's an older variety that you're, the biggest selection of daylilies and irises and other things are available online from mail order nurseries. Loon Song Garden in Maine, I think, carries Statuesque. Okay. Heuchera, decades ago, the only Heuchera grown in gardens was one we called coral bells, which had green foliage with slight mottling. And in the north, where we didn't know liriope, we lined our sidewalks with either hostas or Heucheras. In the south, it's more common to plant liriope, but I'm happy to tell you, research has shown that none of these plants have to be grown in a straight line. The Heucheras or coral bells are now available in almost every color of foliage you can imagine. They are evergreens, so they are adding color to the gardens year-round. They are shade plants. They don't want a soggy spot, just average moisture, or they're fairly tolerant of dry locations as well. If you've ever grown African violets, you know how you have to divide an African violet and reset it every few years. Well, the Heucheras are that same way. They have woody stems that sort of grow up out of the ground, and then they start to not grow as well. But if you just dig the plant up and pull it into several pieces and plant them a little bit deeper like you plant your tomato plants. They'll soon freshen up and make a nice clump again. There are so many selections nowadays. Do a little research before you buy, and buy the ones that were bred for heat tolerance, because the ones that are bred for heat tolerance are pretty reliable in the garden. Some will just sort of peter out over a few years.
Question.
Yes.
So do the deer eat trees or not?
Deer do eat heucheras, is my experience. Someone raised their hand and tell me they never eat them in their garden. There are repellents you can put on things in gardens. And fences, 8-foot fences work really well in deer. This group of plants generally deer don't eat except unless they have absolutely nothing else to use. The hellebores, there's a species of hellebore called Christmas rose that's in bloom now. Well, all of these are blooming now. And then wide range, the most common one are the ones known as Lenten roses. They're shade plants. They're very tolerant of dry shade. I would certainly avoid a wet spot. The evergreen foliage is an asset. There's so much breeding going on. This is really a very exciting time to be gardening with ornamental plants, because there is so much breeding work going on in so many groups of plants. And some of the new hybrid hellebores are sterile, so they don't set seed. Now, if you've never grown the Lenten roses, you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you've grown the Lenten rose, it's sort of like having a cat that's not fixed, and every 6 months you have another litter of kittens you can deal with. The Lenten roses are extremely fertile, and you'll have carpets of seedlings under the ground, and at some point you probably have more than you need, and you have to abandon them on your neighbor's doorstep like you do with the zucchini in the summer. There is a way to deal with it. After they're done blooming, you can cut the flower stalks off so they don't set seed or ripen seed. But go on. Here's on the left an example of the color range you have in the modern Lenten roses. And on the right is one example of some of the exciting new breeding going on. This is one called Anna's Red. There's Penny's Pink and Glenda's Gloss and all sorts of things. But they are sterile, so you don't get any seedlings, so you don't have that maintenance issue or potential maintenance issue. But I want to especially point out the beautiful foliage. These are hybrids between several different species of hellebores, and one of them, Hellebores libidus, which is the only one that's not winter hardy, gives that modeling to that foliage. So you have this beautiful foliage year round in a plant that's fully winter hardy. And they're in bloom now. There's a lot of Anna's Red out by the pedestrian entrance. Hibiscus, the rose mallows or swamp mallow or marshmallow, is the plant with the big red flowers there. Red, pink, white is the normal color range. A lot of breeding work going on in that group as well. Sun perennials, average moisture or even a wet site. Selections vary from 3 feet to 9 feet or more. So be aware that when you're selecting them. The genus Hibiscus is large. Many of them are tropical shrubs or trees. The Rose of Sharon is a hardy shrub that is it's a woody hibiscus, but the swamp mallow or rose mallow is a herbaceous perennial. Even though it looks like a great big shrub, it dies to the ground every year. Super easy plant. Again, my big photos didn't work out. Iris is a great big genus. Another example where this scientific name is the same as the common name. There are many different types of iris that are suitable to our climate. There are also some that are not, but the ones that show up in garden centers are ones that do well for us. The most common one are the bearded iris. Those pictured are fairly modern ones, big and ruffly. If ruffly flowers make you nervous, and they do make me nervous. I love the older bearded irises that are simpler flowers without all those ruffles. But as much as I love the bearded irises, their downside is the foliage often isn't all that attractive. Some of them have clean foliage, but some of them have foliage that gets some sort of disease going on them. But they are tough and reliable, but my first choice for beginners would be one of these other groups of iris, the Siberian, Japanese, Louisiana, or the Japanese group iris. On the left are Siberian iris. There's a number of different cultivars in it. This picture, they weren't identified. This tall one on the left is probably Caesar's brother, which is a fairly old variety, but it is still one of my favorites because it's tall and graceful. You have a range of colors. When I'm selecting plants, whether for design or my own garden, because most herbaceous perennials bloom for 2 weeks or something in that neighborhood, I always ask, well, what does the plant look like out of bloom? Bearded iris is gorgeous in bloom, but you might not want to be looking at its foliage the rest of the year. But the Siberian iris have really beautiful foliage all through the summer. And then in the winter, it turns a nice sort of gold color, eventually turning brown. And so not only, obviously I love the flowers, but it's also a handsome foliage plant. It will take average moisture or slightly damp soil. And both of these on this slide are for sun. The Louisiana irises are bred from several different native species native to the swamps of the southeast. They come in a wide range of colors. Some of the blues are really, really beautiful, clear, true blues. They are spreaders. So whereas the Siberian iris makes a nice tight clump, the Louisiana iris are spreaders. And the wetter the soil, the better. If you have a pond, an earth bottom pond, if you planted it right at the edge of the pond, it'll grow out into the water a bit of the way. Though they do love wet, they will tolerate average moisture. Their foliage isn't the prettiest through the summer months. They do put up new foliage in the fall, which is nice and clean all winter, and then they bloom, probably about May or so. The Japanese iris on the left. They've been bred. The wild type has a fairly modest sized flower, but the garden forms have really large flowers. And instead of the usual 3 petals, they often have 6 petals. They are traditionally exhibited in a container set in a pond, but where they really want to grow is in moist soil, but not staining water. But in Japan, the tradition is to display them in staining water. Now, all the irises I've talked about thus far are for the sun. One of the best irises for the shade is the Japanese roof iris. This is the typical color. There's also a pure white form, which is lovely. But it's also a beautiful foliage plant through the rest of the growing season.
How's the foliage for the Japanese iris?
The foliage on the Japanese iris is fine. It's not as pretty as the Siberian, but you wouldn't grow it for its foliage, but you won't object to it being taking up space in the garden. Okay. Most people know lantana. Most of the lantanas that are for sale in the garden center are not winter hardy. The ones that aren't winter hardy are entirely worth growing because for a few dollars you're going to have something that blooms all summer long through the hottest, driest parts of the summer. But there are a few selections that are winter hardy. Miss Huff is the most reliably winter hardy. It's close to this one in color. Star Landing is that color, nice clear orange and yellow. Ham and Eggs is a pink and yellow one. And The ones that are winter hardy, they get great big over the course of the summer. They die to the ground in the winter, but then regrow in the summer. They will bloom through the driest part of the summer, and pollinators love them. Butterflies, hummingbirds will make some use of them. And they're for full sun. You can grow them in like light shade or part sun, but the plants are going to be sort of scrawny and not bloom as much. They're more sun the better on those. Nepeta, the catnip, an easy, reliable perennial. Nowadays, there's many selections. They vary. They look pretty much identical, except they vary in size, and some of them bloom earlier or later than others. Generally, when they are in bloom, the flower stalks are bobbing up and down with bumblebees visiting the flowers. They are fairly drought tolerant. They do not like a wet spot. Phlox is another large genus, almost entirely native to North America. There are a lot of spring blooming ones. Some of them are tiny little rock garden plants. I'm focused on one here, Phlox paniculata. It's the summer phlox. I value anything that blooms through the worst months of the summer, and it'll bloom for June, July, August, maybe a little bit longer. There are nowadays many selections. Choose one that is known to be mildew resistant. If they get powdery mildew, those green leaves will be white with powdery mildew. The plant will still bloom, but the plant will be unsightly. But there are plenty of selections that are fully resistant to powdery mildew. And it's, again, a good butterfly plant. Put the Phlox paniculata where you want it to stay, because it's easy to transplant, but it's one of the few herbaceous perennials that can be grown from root cuttings. So if you transplant the plant, every little piece of root you leave behind is going to regrow, and you're going to still have that phlox in that same location. It's a little bit like transplanting a yucca. It's really the best way to propagate a yucca is to dig it up and transplant it, because it's going to grow back from every rise. The rudbeckias, the orange coneflowers, are good summer bloomers. I think quite a few of them are really beautiful in the winter months. You see the dark center to those flowers. Those persist all winter, and they're really beautiful through the winter months. Many herbaceous perennials are beautiful in the winter months as well, in their seed heads and stuff. And the orange cone flowers are great for pollinators, and then the seed-eating birds like finches will make use of the seeds. This is probably the most common one, Rudbeckia fulgida. The most common selection is one called gold stern. And though they will thrive out in full sun, they're quite good in light shade. Two other really good Rudbeckias, Rudbeckia maxima. You might figure out that maxima is referring to being big. It has these blue-gray leaves, a bit like hostas, but the plant is, probably 7-8 feet tall. It blooms early enough in summer, but that by the time fall comes, those seed heads are no longer showy, so that is one we cut down before winter. The one on the right, Rudbeckia herbstsonne, there you have a cultivar name that's German. And Herbstsonne just means fall sun, autumn sun. And so it's often sold as Rudbeckia autumn sun. But it's another tall thing, 7-8 feet tall. But the little head in the middle of those flowers are just gorgeous all year long.
Does the maxima, can you plant the cone from the maxima for new plants, or do you have to, how do you propagate?
Rudbeckia maxima is a wild plant. It does produce viable seed. We get a fair number of seedlings in the garden, so yes, you could start it from seed. Yeah.
It doesn't like to be moved.
It doesn't like to be moved? Oh, I don't.
Mine
do.
doesn't.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, there is one cultivar, one selection of Rudbeckia maxima that has yellow foliage. That one probably wouldn't come true from seed, but all the other ones being grown in gardens they're not selections from the wild, it's just the straight wild type, so they would come true from seed. Okay. Salvia is a huge genus, commonly known as sages. You know, most are sun plants. There are a few really great shade plants, but they come from so many different climates. Some of them are super well adapted to this area. Others are either not winter hardy or need a much drier climate, wouldn't tolerate our humid summers. But the salvia, the ornamental salvia, you're most likely to encounter in a garden center are the salvia nemorosa or salvia superba. There's selections like May Night and several others that they grow all right for us. They don't thrive, and they tend to disappear after a few years. You know, it's a case of a plant that's better suited to a colder climate than here. But there are so many salvias that absolutely thrive in our climate. And many of them are great pollinator plants. Few great salvias are Salvia farinacea, the mealy cup sage, spikes of blue or white flowers all summer long. The next one, I have pictures of the others, so I think I'll just go on to them. Salvia hot lips is an example of like a Salvia gregii or Salvia microphylla. These are actually subshrubs. They have woody stems, but late winter you need to cut it back by about half. And they will bloom all summer long up until frost. Some of them have the common name of autumn sage, I think because they're native to hotter, drier parts of this country, the southwest of Mexico, where they probably stop blooming in the heat and drought of summer and freshen up in the fall, but in our climate they tend to bloom all summer long. Hot lips is an interesting one because the flowers vary. They can be all white or all red, or more commonly this bicolored flower. There's so many good selections in the Salvia gregii and microphylla. Salvia black and bloom is a selection of what I knew as Salvia guaranitica, that is now renamed Salvia cerulea. I'm not one who puts much effort into creating a common name for a plant that doesn't have one, but Salvia guaranitica wasn't too user-friendly a name, and because hummingbirds absolutely love this plant, I've often promoted the common name of hummingbird sage. This will bloom from May up until frost. It will grow in full sun. It's quite good in light shade. It'll tolerate damp soil. Now, pay attention to the fact that that is black and bloom with an M on the end, because in older selections, black and blue is typical of the wild type of the species that spreads. Now, I had a client that had a 23-acre garden, and they liked big masses of things, so things that spread like that were fine. But most of us don't have 23 acres or even 1 acre, and so we're better off with plants that don't spread aggressively. And black and bloom with the M on the end does not spread. It's a clumped one. But there's a lot of breeding work going on in this type of salvia, and one of the things they're breeding for are ones that don't spread. Black and bloom also has more flowers and a spike, and they're slightly bigger than black and blue. But there are even newer things than black and bloom, some that are more compact. But a superb plant, and this is one of those plants that starts blooming in May, so by August, if it looks shabby, I'll cut it to the ground. And people usually ask the question, do you mean to the ground? Yes, I mean to the ground. It'll soon be back in growth, and probably 5-6 weeks later, it's back in bloom, and it'll bloom up until frost. So it's one I highly recommend, and who wouldn't be happy to have something that's attracting hummingbirds to your garden?
When you cut it down, how do you cut it? What do you use to cut it all the way?
Pruning shears?
Pruning shears.
Yeah.
Not a weed whacker.
Oh, you could use a weed whacker.
Okay.
Yeah. The stems are pretty hard.
Yeah.
It is a herbaceous perennial that dies to the ground, but the stems get fairly woody in that one growing season. But it doesn't matter what you use.
Okay.
I've often have used the lawnmower to cut the garden down after frost, and then it mulches things up. Now, this is a plant maybe you haven't encountered. Syningia, the hardy gloxinia. The Syningia is a family of mostly tropical plants. Think of African violets and flame violets and stuff like that. So these weren't something we were aware of before maybe a dozen years ago, but there's an ever-increasing number of members of this family that are winter hardy. And these Syningias, if you look at it, maybe not overly impressive if it only bloomed like this for 2 weeks, but this is going to bloom from May till frost. And this is one called Cherry's Jubilee. This color is really common. There's similar things like Towering Inferno and Scarlet O'Hara, but then there's Bananas Foster, which you might imagine is yellow, which it is. And there's some cream-colored ones, and there's a related species, Syningia tubiflora, which is pure white. But they are really superb perennials for a sunny spot, and starting to show up more widely. My last shot, which again, it's one of my pictures that didn't shrink down, but I wanted to end this presentation by saying my first love, I've gardened all my life, my first love were winter hardy herbaceous perennials. But over the years, I came to realize that the best gardens usually combine all these different groups of plants. Perennials don't need to go in a perennial garden. Shrubs don't have to be in a shrub border. You can mix all these things up, and usually these different groups of plants bring different assets to the table. And so combining these different groups of plants together, I think you can create a better display than if you segregate them into separate places. Or if you're interested in pollinator plants, you don't have to plant a pollinator garden. You can incorporate all these plants together, because so many of these things we grow as ornamentals are also good pollinator plants. I have no clue what time it is. Are we good?
I think you're right on time, Doug.
Okay, that's unusual for me.
1 minute over.
What?
1 minute over.
Oh, okay. I'll be around all morning, mostly outside, but you can ask me questions. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is the right time to ask, but can you comment, if it's appropriate, on growing roses here in Raleigh?
I'm going to talk about trees and shrubs a little bit later, and I can address that. Remind me. We're trying to stay on track, and we're going to take a break. Doug will be around. He may be out by the plant cart, because we do have some plants for sale. And he's here all the time. He's out in the garden, and the rest of our horticulture staff are all fantastically knowledgeable. So always happy to answer questions. And so grab him and pick his brain, because he's got well.